The flashing blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your stomach tightens. You weren't speeding, at least you don't think you were. You glance at your hands on the steering wheel, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement you make. The officer steps out of the cruiser, slow and deliberate, adjusting something on their belt. It feels like time just stretched. Have you ever been pulled over and felt like the situation escalated way faster than it should have? If you have, I want you to share that experience in the comments, because what most people don't realize is that those moments, those small decisions, pauses, and reactions can completely change the outcome of a traffic stop. And later in this discussion, I'm going to break down one specific mistake that turns ordinary stops into dangerous encounters more often than people think. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable but real. When people hear about a violent arrest, especially one where officers punch or physically overpower someone, the first instinct is to assume there's more to the story. Maybe the person resisted, maybe they did something, maybe the officers felt threatened. That's the narrative people lean on because it makes things feel predictable, controllable. But that's not always how it plays out. There are real situations where a stop begins as routine, expired registration, a broken taillight, a minor traffic infraction, and within minutes, it spirals into something aggressive, chaotic, and frankly, unnecessary. And when that happens, it's not just about legality anymore. It becomes about psychology, perception, and control. Picture this. A woman is driving home. It's late, but not unusually so. She notices a patrol car behind her, but doesn't think much of it until the lights come on. She pulls over, maybe a little slower than the officer expects because she's looking for a safe spot. Already in the officer's mind, a note is made. Delayed compliance. That might sound small, but officers are trained to read behavior in fragments. They don't see your intentions, they see patterns. Delay, hesitation, reaching around inside the car, those things start stacking up in their mental checklist. The officer approaches. Do you know why I pulled you over? That question isn't just casual conversation, it's strategic. They're watching how you respond. Do you admit something? Do you hesitate? Do you challenge them? Now here's where things often start to drift. The woman might respond honestly, no, I don't. Or maybe she says, was I speeding? Or maybe she's nervous and talks too much, explaining where she's coming from, where she's going, why she's out late. Each of those responses tells the officer something, not necessarily something accurate, but something interpreted. Officers are constantly assessing threat levels, but here's the part most people don't understand. That assessment is heavily influenced by behavior that might be completely innocent. A shaky voice, avoiding eye contact, over-explaining, even being overly polite can sometimes be read as nervousness rather than respect. Now let's fast forward slightly. The officer asks for license, registration, insurance. She provides them. But maybe she fumbles a bit. Maybe she reaches into her glove compartment quickly without narrating her movements. Maybe she sighs out of frustration. Again, tiny things. But those tiny things start building tension. Now imagine the officer walks back to the cruiser, runs her information, and comes back with a different tone. This happens more often than people realize. The tone shift is one of the biggest turning points in any stop. Step out of the vehicle. That's legal in most situations. Courts have consistently allowed officers to order drivers out of vehicles during traffic stops for safety reasons. But from the driver's perspective, that moment feels like escalation. Why do I need to step out? That question alone can change everything. Not because it's illegal to ask, but because of how it's perceived. To the officer, it can sound like resistance. Not compliance, not refusal, just resistance. And resistance, in policing terms, doesn't need to be dramatic to be taken seriously. Now imagine this moment stretching. The officer repeats the command. Maybe their voice gets sharper. Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now. Now the pressure is on. People freeze in these moments. They hesitate. They try to process what's happening. And hesitation, again, gets interpreted. This is where things can go sideways fast. If the driver delays even a few seconds longer, the officer might open the door themselves. That sudden physical action, reaching into the car, can trigger a reaction. The driver might pull back instinctively, not to resist but to protect personal space. But that movement, it's often read as active resistance, and once that label sticks, the entire interaction shifts. Commands get louder, movements get faster, backup might be called. Now imagine multiple officers on scene. Each officer is coming into a situation they didn't witness from the beginning. They're relying on the primary officer's interpretation. If that interpretation is non-compliant driver, everything is filtered through that lens. This is how situations escalate from calm to chaotic in seconds. Now let's address the uncomfortable part: physical force. When officers decide to use force, they justify it based on what they perceive as resistance or threat. But perception isn't always reality. And in high-stress environments, perception can be flawed. A woman being pulled from her car, pushed against the hood, or even struck. It doesn't always start with aggression from her side. Sometimes it starts with confusion, hesitation, or miscommunication that snowballs. You might be thinking, well, why didn't she just comply immediately? That's the question people always ask. But in real life, compliance isn't always instant or perfect. People are confused, they're scared, they don't process commands like robots. And officers, despite training, are still human. They bring their own stress, biases, and expectations into the interaction. Now here's something most drivers don't realize. Officers are trained to control the scene quickly. The longer a stop drags on without clear compliance, the more they feel the situation slipping out of control. And control is everything in policing. So when control feels threatened, even slightly, they escalate to regain it. That escalation can look like grabbing an arm, forcing someone out of a vehicle, or in extreme cases, striking them. Now let's talk about a critical mistake that drivers make in these situations, and I hinted at this earlier. They try to argue in the moment, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just logically. Why am I being detained? I didn't do anything wrong. You can't do this. Those statements might be legally grounded, but timing is everything. During a roadside stop, especially one that's already tense, those statements don't de-escalate. They often do the opposite. To the officer, it sounds like defiance dressed as logic. And here's the hard truth. The roadside is not where legal debates get resolved. It's where control is established. That doesn't mean your rights disappear. It means the environment is not neutral. It's tilted toward enforcement. So when someone insists on debating instead of complying, even calmly, it can trigger escalation. Now let's flip perspective for a moment. From the officer's point of view, they're approaching a vehicle with limited information. They don't know who you are. They don't know your intentions. They're scanning for threats constantly. Hands matter. Movement matters. Tone matters. If your hands disappear from view, even briefly, that raises concern. If you start reaching without explanation, that raises concern. If your tone shifts from cooperative to defensive, that raises concern. And once concern crosses a certain threshold, officers act. Not always correctly, not always fairly, but quickly. Now back to the scenario. The woman is out of the vehicle. The situation is tense. Maybe she pulls her arm away when the officer grabs her. Maybe she says, "Don't touch me." That's a natural reaction for many people. But in that moment, it's interpreted as resistance. And once resistance is declared, force becomes justified in the officer's framework. This is where things can turn violent. A push becomes a shove. A grip becomes a takedown. A takedown becomes strikes. And afterward, the report might say, "Subject resisted arrest." That phrase carries a lot of weight. It shapes how the entire incident is viewed. But what counts as resistance? That's where things get blurry. Is pulling your arm away resistance? Is stepping back resistance? Is asking questions instead of immediately complying resistance? In many real-world situations, the answer becomes yes. And that's where the disconnect lies between public expectation and police interpretation. Now, let me be clear about something. There are absolutely situations where force is necessary. There are dangerous individuals, real threats, and moments where officers have to act decisively. But there are also situations where force escalates unnecessarily because of miscommunication, impatience, or misinterpretation. And those are the situations people struggle with, because from the outside it looks like abuse. From inside the moment it might feel like control slipping away, and somewhere in between is the truth. Now here's something practical that rarely gets talked about: silence. People often hear that they have the right to remain silent, and that's true. But silence during a traffic stop has a psychological impact. If you go completely silent without communicating why, it can make officers uneasy. They might interpret it as uncooperative or suspicious. So instead of just going silent, there's a more effective approach. I'm choosing to remain silent, but I will comply with your instructions. That statement does two things. It asserts your right, and it reassures the officer that you're not a threat. It sounds simple, but in real-world stops, that clarity can prevent escalation. Another thing people overlook is pacing. Moving too fast or too slow can both cause problems. If you move quickly, it can seem aggressive. If you move too slowly, it can seem resistant. So narrating your actions helps. I'm reaching for my registration. It's in the glove compartment. These small verbal cues reduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is what drives a lot of escalation. Now let's go back to the emotional side of this. Being pulled over is stressful. Being ordered out of your car is even more stressful. Being physically handled by an officer? That's overwhelming. People don't respond perfectly under stress. They flinch, they tense up, they react instinctively. But those reactions can be misread. And that's the dangerous gap. Because once an officer believes you're resisting, their response is guided by that belief, not your intention. Now think about how quickly that can spiral. A second of hesitation, a quick movement, a defensive reaction. Suddenly, you're on the ground, being restrained, possibly struck. And afterward, everything gets analyzed in slow motion, by courts, by the public, by the media. But in the moment, it happens fast. Too fast for perfect decisions, too fast for clear communication, and sometimes too fast to prevent harm. Now here's a question worth thinking about. If you were in that situation, would you prioritize being right or being safe? Because those two things don't always align in the moment. You might be completely within your rights, you might be treated unfairly, you might even be dealing with an officer who is out of line. But the roadside is not where that gets fixed. It's where outcomes are shaped. And sometimes, survival, physical and legal, means managing the moment rather than winning the argument. That doesn't mean accepting abuse. It means understanding the environment you're in. Because once force is used, everything becomes more complicated. Injuries, charges, legal battles. And even if you're ultimately cleared, the experience itself can be damaging. Now, let's address something people rarely say out loud. Some officers escalate because they can. Not all, not most, but enough that it matters. And that's why awareness is critical, not paranoia, not fear, awareness. Understanding how stops work, understanding how behavior is interpreted, understanding how quickly things can shift. Because the more you understand that, the better you can navigate it. And navigating it isn't about submission, it's about control. Your control over your actions, your tone, your responses. Because in a situation where you have limited power, the one thing you still control is how you respond. And that can make all the difference. So the next time you see those lights in your mirror, remember this. It's not just about what you did before the stop. It's about everything that happens after.